Welcome to Quantify Your Hunt. And if you saw this at B-Sides Charm, I am very pleased to remind you, this is not that talk. This is about half of this is going to be new content, and it's going to end in a very different place. So without further ado, let's get started. This is the agenda. We're going to cover all of these topics at some point in this talk. We may not have time for questions, but we will stick around this evening. So if you've got anything you want to follow up with, please let us know. And so next, who we are. We're not as interesting as this topic. Yeah, my name's Devon. I spent a lot of time doing IR and more recently working on Endgame solutions, basically trying to make this easier for threat hunters, particularly things like make it easier for you to get to initial compromise so you can really contain very quickly. I run our SOC, I run our IR team, and I do a bunch of other stuff in the public. I'm not the original author of Red Team Automation, which is one of the simulation frameworks that we kind of talk about, but I am its biggest spokesperson. Roberto, take it away.
All right, thank you very much, everybody, for coming today also. And it's my first time here in the Threat Hunting Summit, so I'm very excited about this opportunity. And I work actually at Spectre Ops, and my Twitter handle, CyberWarDog. I think you guys have seen some of the projects out there. I'm the author of the Threat Hunter Playbook, the Help, OSIM, which is more like documenting data sets and things like that. And the primary two goals, I guess, that I have with my projects is always to learn something new, because that's how I learn actually a little bit about MITRE ATT&CK, a little bit about Elastic and things like that. It's just to learn the application, but at the same time also to share pretty much everything that I do with the community. And I think that that's what keeps me going. And every time I have an idea, I'm like, you know what, let's make it an open source project and let's just share it with everybody. And I'm a former Capital One senior threat hunter. That's where I actually had my first experience to understand data at scale. Because I had never worked with more than 500,000 endpoints and things like that, and that was actually really interesting to see how things change from a 20,000 to a 500,000 endpoint environment. All right, so why this talk? And I've heard a lot about different talks that happened today and yesterday, and there's some great ideas about how you can start being effective at hunting and things like that. But something that we like to share today is to start kind of also focusing on the things that we have seen companies still struggle with. And one of them could be just as basic as mapping your hunting engagements to business use cases, and how you do start sharing the effectiveness and how you're going over with your hunting engagements. But at the same time also how you can start showing transparency to your senior leadership. Right, because you got to show them how you're doing your progress over time and things like that, how you map your tools back to, for example, techniques and things like that. That would show also the effectiveness of your hunting engagement. And of course, at the end, for people that don't know where to start and things like that, I believe that this talk also helps you to understand how you can prioritize what you do before you want to start hunting engagement and things like that. And we're going to start using also some type of understanding of using simulation for measuring your hunting engagement and things like that as well. So, but first, it's very important to understand exactly what effective hunting is. And I think that that's pretty much what drives exactly what you do in a hunting engagement, how you prepare, and things like that. And the problem that I see a lot in the industry is that there is this buzzword that you can just, everything is effective, right? And you can use a product, you can use just anything, and can just be an effective threat hunting tool.
Yeah, you can dance up on a robot.
Yeah,
you're better at threat hunting.
Exactly.
All these things work.
The idea is to make sure that we understand why that's so important to define this specific word, like effectiveness. And I think that I've heard people using efficiency, efficacy, and effectiveness, like if it was the same thing. The problem is that actually efficiency is when you start making the most out of the resources that you have, and then efficacy focuses more on achieving the objective. And I think that there is where we start thinking from a hunting perspective. We say, we gotta find evil, and we gotta uncover an incident. You start just creating this mentality that that's all you have to do when you hunt. Well, the problem is that if you wanna be effective, you gotta take pretty much both in consideration, right? You have to understand how you can achieve your objective, but how you can do it using the resources that you have. We've been talking about data a lot in these past couple of presentations before ours, and I'm so excited that actually that's being also shared with everybody nowadays, because it's last year I didn't hear that much about basing your hunting engagements on the data that you have and things like that. So effectiveness is huge. I understand why how you can start mapping that to your engagements. Now, in this case, I can tell you that from an efficiency perspective, that's when you start thinking about MITRE ATT&CK, for example, like as a number one, where you have to be able to categorize your techniques and things that you're doing. And I think that that's pretty much where it fits. It helps you to be a little bit more efficient than just saying, let's hunt for, I don't know, like this new thing that I don't know what it is, let's just figure it out. At least that allows you to create some type of like order in what you do, understanding what you have, because you want to make sure that it's not just, I would say like, normal just to say, let's enable process monitoring, but then at the end you don't understand exactly if the data is complete and things like that. So you got to be more efficient into what you do and what you enable in your environment. At the same time, understand if you have the right people, right, the right skills, right? Because as we were hearing also Rob Lee talking about that, if you even apply a machine learning model and things like that, if you don't have the right people that can understand that, the results and how you can even make it better with the data that you have, then you might not be as successful with that specific model. And efficacy, of course, in this part is where we start thinking more like if you measure your hunting engagements by just how many incidents you uncover, let me tell you, you're going to definitely have a really bad time telling your senior leadership what you do every day and how that's affecting your organization. Because you might find something today, but probably in 3 months you don't find anything. And then it turns back into like, hey, you're actually not doing anything from a hunting perspective. So that's where you show it more from, hey, I'm being efficient. I'm actually validating the detection of this technique rather than just saying, I'm going to uncover an incident today and things like that.
So where do we start? This is the question we often get, and we're going to give you a couple of ideas for places that we think are reasonable. Obviously, if we just kind of run off and randomly do this, we're going to wind up getting nowhere. So our suggestion is to be a little bit more targeted and to think about the type of attack model that's helpful. This really started, I think, with some of the research that Roberto did. So How Hot Is Your Hunt Team, I think, is one of the first blog posts I read that got me really excited about threat hunting again. I felt like it kind of had fallen off a cliff, so to speak. There wasn't a lot of innovation. And then as soon as this was conceptualized for me, actually, I think that's when Roberto and I started collaborating a lot more often. And then much more recently, Ready to Hunt, Show Me Your Data, basically assessing data quality as an input into this process, which is, I think, really foundational.
And the idea with these two blog posts, because I want to make sure that everybody understands the value that I was trying to share with this. Like the first one with the heat map was just the idea that if you want to show some type of either coverage or how good you are or how you can pretty much track your progress, a visualization goes ways. Like I actually talked to senior leadership when they were trying to buy a tool, and they explained to you how you can tell them how effective you can be with that tool and things like that. If you start going through like 5, 6 slides, they just start looking at their phones and they don't even care. But if you're at least showing a visualization, then the conversation kind of like starts going through with your nice heat map, and you can talk about it a little bit, where your weaknesses are and things like that. That's a transparency that you got to start going forward. But that was just an idea. That was like how you can start at least showing something. Then how you build on the top of it and how you use it, that depends on your organization and exactly what you want to show with it. And the second one was, of course, just focusing more into, hey, it's not as easy as just saying, I'm going to hunt today. Let's go and hunt for this weekend. No. First, show me the data that you want to hunt with. I think that also was mentioned before that would avoid probably spending 30 days of a hunting engagement that you might not even have the data to work with. Mm-hmm. And how you can start measuring that data, like the quality of your data. So there's when we start. So what are you potentially measuring already? This is also very interesting because you might not even think about it if you're not doing some type of numbers around your hunting engagement, but the conversations that I've had before are, hey, can we, if this happens next week in this environment, can we detect it? And you start thinking, maybe, probability could be like 20%, 30%. That to me sounds a little bit like when you want to forecast the weather and you say, there's a probability of 50% it might rain next week. That actually, it's a thing. And it's actually was explained by, I can't see that well, Ryan McGeegan, which goes under Magoo in Twitter. And he talks about risk forecasting. And this is great because now I can start thinking like how I can provide some type of numbers with what I do. And in this case, he's showing how you can choose a scenario, then you decompose the scenario, identifying threats, then you start pretty much gathering supporting data to reduce the bias. And then you can forecast and say, hey, this is the probability. I start with a baseline of like 20%. And then as I go and add security controls, not necessarily hunting engagements, but you can start feeling like, you know what, yeah, 10%, 15%. And at the end, you can see, for example, you can increase confidence against a 15% of difference that when you're doing your forecasting. Very interesting, because this will definitely start mapping to concepts that you might be familiar with, which is just basic threat modeling, for example. Where you model the system, you pick the system, you model it, identify the threats, understand how those threats work, and then you address the threats, validate the detection of this, you measure again, and you keep going that way. This is very interesting, because now in these scenarios, for example, you start identifying the connections between these crown jewels, for example, how the data flows, what are the external connections, trust boundaries around those things. Very interesting, because when you start thinking about what can I measure from this perspective, there is a lot of data that gets generated across this model, for example. Okay? So where do you fit hunt with this? And I think that this is also an interesting question, because threat hunting, we all see it as this nice program where you have different steps, identify a technique, hypothesis, but at the end of the day, if you don't understand exactly how you can map that to a business use case or to how your systems actually work, then to me, it's not actually that valuable. Okay? So when you start now going back to the other frameworks that I was talking about, like threat modeling or like risk forecasting, there is some similarities going on in here, for example. Some of you might agree, some of you might disagree that, for example, threat hunting to me could be also part of when you try to mitigate risk, when you want to reduce the risk of the attacker achieving an objective. Threat hunting could be part of that, but at the same time, you can start identifying that some steps might be similar and how you can start then mapping them to how your organization works, your systems and your crown jewels. In this case, if you model what happens around your most important systems, you might probably then start identifying, for example, MITRE ATT&CK techniques that would fit into exactly what let me go back in here, exactly where the data flows goes. I focus on some, for example, lateral movement between systems that might get to this crown jewel that you have. You give it a meaning. It's not anymore this isolated process that you want to just hunt for the weekend. You actually have some type of connection across what you're doing in your organization, most likely. So what can we measure from then a hunt, or in this case, I like when Devon actually cross-hunt and say, it's just basically detection, right? Then when you start understanding that if you're modeling your systems and you're hunting across that model, then I want to understand what happened across my trust boundaries, how my data flows. Then I started then saying, you know what, to me it's very important to know what percentage of data I have for the detection or for any type of preventive measure in my model. What tools are helping me the most? What data is helping me the most across all my data sets? Because we also know that even though we say that it's cheaper now to store data, and we start going with solutions that charge a lot of money for data, you have to understand what data is what it's the most value in your organization, how much you can cover with that data and things like that. And at the end, you can start answering questions and how are we reducing the probability of an attacker to achieve an objective? You can provide data, data numbers or metrics to answer those questions.
So this kind of all brings us to attack. Roberto alluded to it before. Enterprise attack is really the practitioner's knowledge base. I'm going to try and trademark that. But I think MITRE has got a pretty good description for what it is. My description is really the most complete source of knowledge about adversary tactics, loosely categorized into 11 different types of adversary objectives with groups, software, and again, if you haven't expressed your love for attack, and you do love attack, the MITRE ATT&CK team is here in the back row, second from the rear. We're big fans, and there's a lot to like. In particular, the fact that all of these techniques are cross-referenced. They all contain metadata that's useful to analysts who don't necessarily understand what these techniques look like in the wild. And even better, they contain reference materials, so links to published documentation, whether that's reports, blog posts, GitHub repos. It is a tremendous asset to teams, especially if you have a knowledge curation problem. This is a place where knowledge is curated. This is just some statistics as of the most recent update to attack's content. Again, we broke it down by OS, and we'll show some further statistics from our analysis of attack that we think you could weaponize.
So yeah, how can you measure against attack? I think that also, right? Because we see attack going this whole conference, which is great, right? So how can you start pretty much getting your strategy of what you have in your environment and then just mapping it back to attack? I think it's important that you understand what attack actually gives to you. Besides just the technique name, besides just the tactic name and the ID, there is actually some data that you can start using to probably mapping it to what I was referring earlier as your threat model, for example, where you have, in this case, what are the permissions that the attacker needs in order to accomplish in a specific technique, for example. And you can start mapping that to your, for example, trust boundaries, the users that have access to that specific system. Like, how does that look like from an attack perspective? What are the techniques that probably you can start using from a user being an admin as well, for example? Later, what is the permission that the attacker will obtain? In this case, for example, system. What are the consequences of this happening? And that's how you start mapping what you're doing. Okay, if an adversary becomes system in here or an admin in here, this is what we can do next, and things like that. The other one that I love the most, of course, is the data sources that are recommended for the detection and the validation for the detection of each technique, for example. Very, very important. And we had a presentation yesterday by Hacker Hurricane, Michael, right? And then he was talking about how you can start mapping data sources to techniques, and something that I'm also doing, which we're going to probably hopefully be collaborating on that piece. And the one that I like also the most is something that I didn't know. It actually, I asked Blake directly, and I was like, hey, what is this supports remote? I see that in some techniques. He's like, oh, that's actually for execution techniques. Yes or no, which technique can be used for a remote event or something like that. You can execute something remotely. Very interesting, because when you start mapping that to your, let's say, to your model into how your system operates and how the data flows goes from system to system, then you can start mapping which techniques will actually happen across two systems, for example. What can you execute remotely and things like that. So when you start understanding this, then you can start then saying, you know what, from a data perspective, process monitoring, for example, covers 70% of the current 219 techniques in attack, for example. And if you go a little further and you say, OK, now map techniques to data sources, I can map into a tactic, but all the way to a platform. Then you can say, OK, you know what? Based out of the 70%, now, of course, Mac OS, Linux, and Windows, from a data perspective in Mac, it kind of like it kind of overlaps, that's the word, sorry. It kind of overlaps. That's what if you add, for example, the numbers in there, it's not going to give you 149, but it actually tells you that from an attack perspective, from a Windows side, 60% is still process monitoring. It's going to help you across all these techniques. If you go a little bit further then, and you start getting information from an adversary perspective, and you can map it from the adversary uses this software uses this technique and things like that, then you can start getting some numbers such as, based on all this information, I can tell that 65% of the groups identified in MITRE ATT&CK, they like a shell, or in this case it would be a reverse shell, using a standard protocol, for example, application layer protocol, such as DNS and stuff like that. So you can get information that then you can pretty much map to what you're trying to accomplish with your hunting engagement. And in this specific scenario, from an adversary perspective, Katie Nichols has done a great job in talking about all these different presentations. MITRE has been pushing that a lot, which is great. And those are two presentations that you can actually see. And you can get information such as challenges that you face when you try to using attack for cyber threat intelligence and things like that. So it's pretty useful. So now that we understand how we can use attack and start mapping it to a detection strategy, then let's go back to the data sources. In the data source piece is when you start understanding that they give you a lot of data. And this is just for reference, because you can go back to the slides and you can see all the data sources that MITRE maps to their techniques. You can then just pick, let's say, these two, process command line parameters and process monitoring. To me, that pretty much maps to a process, what a process is, right? And I define what I need from that process. When you start doing this exercise, you're technically modeling your data. because you're finding the structure of your data and you're finding relationships across what you're identifying with attack. MITRE did a great job also by starting a model, it's like a couple years ago with the first versions of Sysmon, and they were using the cyber observable objects from STIX to define what pretty much the data objects are. In this case, I'm defining my own too in my project OSEM, where I say an IP is supposed to have this information, a process is supposed to have this, and then a file as well. When I start doing this, I find that there are relationships across these objects, because a process creates a file, a process creates another process, and a process can connect to an IP. When I start doing that, then I start building relationships. Source, destination, my relationship, it's like a basic, probably graphing, but you're defining the model. So in this case, if we go back to process use of network, then I can tell you that that's basically a process connecting to an IP, to a host name, to a URL. Then I can say, you know what? The information that I need from a process, information I need from an IP will give me that information. So I can start saying Sysmon can give me process. At the same time, Windows Security Event Logs can give me a process information. It's something that, that is being done already. But at the same time, you have to understand that when you start looking into the data that you need versus what you have, you can start measuring that. You can tell that 4680A is missing some fields that might be valuable to you that Sysmon provides. Now, this is not the only thing. If you look into this specific relationship, we're just talking about it from a process perspective, Sysmon Event ID 1 and then 4680A. But our relationship was process connecting to an IP. So for that, you will pretty much need Sysmon Event ID 3, for example. So that changes how your data connects to what MITRE pretty much asks you or not ask you, but request and recommends to use as a data set for the detection of that technique. So that's why you start saying, I shouldn't just be mapping a process data set that MITRE recommends to Sysmon Event ID 1, because then if you require process use of network, you might not get it with 4680A by itself. That's how you start pretty much putting numbers into what you have in order to go and start hunting. In this case, I was able to create just a basic model also from what Sysmon provides. So depending on the events, a process creates a file, creates a registry, renames a registry, updates a registry. You have a lot of information that they provide to you. That's what you should be doing, modeling your data sources so you can tell what data sources will help you for specific techniques, and not just say, process, this is what I have. No, if a process talks to an IP, I might need a different data source. So in this case, what we're trying to accomplish is that we don't just want to do a mapping of a tactic straight to Sysmon. We want to start creating a connection that will make sense where metrics can be applied. I can start measuring exactly what I need for Sysmon, what I have, how it helps me to create also analytics based on the data model. That to me is more valuable than just saying, I bought this tool and detects PowerShell. No, right? So that gives me extra context that would allow me to be a little bit more efficient. We come back to efficiency. I don't just want to detect something. I want to be efficient at detecting that specific technique. And of course, remember, Matt Graver and also Lee Christensen in Black Hat, they were showing how also an attacker can influence the data. And in this case, in this specific event, these are the data fields that it's high attacker influence rating. So when you understand that as well, then you can start weighting when you build your signatures, for example. If you have to build a signature at the end because your hunting engagement might not be just needed to happen every day, you have to be mindful that you got to understand what an attacker can also influence as well, and that might affect your metrics as well.
So this kind of brings us to the question of what can I measure? Because we talk about measuring techniques. Do we finally have what we need? And data quality is an important point. I mean, we can express availability of evidence as a ratio. We can attempt to assess data just by eyeballing it, but there actually are ways for us to measure the quality of our data. This is a quote that basically just gives an all-purpose description of what data quality is, but the thing to take away is it is only of high quality if it serves the purpose you need it to work for. And the DoD, fortunately, has a standard that gives us 6 attributes of data quality, and each one is represented as a ratio or a percentage, which again fits right into our plan of being able to quantify every aspect of this. We're going to focus on 3 of these aspects that we think are most relevant to our purposes. Just be aware those other attributes do still exist and can still be measured.
Yep, and the reason why I also decided to pick these 3 is because I heard this a lot. Why do I have to focus on doing some like data governance and management? I'm a threat hunter. What am I supposed to be doing that stuff? Well, you as a hunter, based on my experience as well, you can influence these areas of data quality. You can influence completeness, consistency, and timeliness in your engagements. And I think that that's very important to understand. So also before that, it's very important to do this because it's not just as, let's collect more data, I think I need this, let's collect this, and let's use it. There should be a process behind that, and data quality accomplishes that. And just as data scientists, they spend the longest time making sure that their data is consistent, their data is complete. That's a similar process that you should be doing. So you as a hunter should be also focusing on that, because at the end, you're going to come up with the best analytic that you could use based on the data you have. And you have to create a process that every data set that you ingest something new has to go through the same process. Is this consistent and is it complete, or do I have enough of that data? From a completeness perspective, we went over this in B-size charm, and this is basically just saying, if I have Sysmon Event ID 1 and Windows Security 4688, sure, am I collecting everything? Well, make sure that you are enabled in process command line. So understand what you really need from a data perspective. Also, completeness can translate into coverage as well. From a hunting engagement, measure what is the data available for you. Let's say your scope touches 100 computers, and at the end of the day, you say, you know what, sorry, we couldn't reach 30 computers. Measure that, because that will actually drive a change to enabling, probably logging, enabling controls that will give you that data next. Consistency, very interesting. As you can see, like Sysmon calls the process whole path image, and then 4688 gives you new process as the data field name. If I run a query just saying image equals something, I might not hit those devices that probably don't have Sysmon, but that have Windows Security event logs. Very, very important, as it was said before, not just because you run a query in your console and nothing comes back, it doesn't mean that something happened. Yeah. So if you're not aware of the consistency of your data sets, you're going to have a hard time proving that probably something didn't happen.
In my old life, I had a customer who really struggled with this, spending 6 figures on data normalization just so that they could run one query and not multiple queries because of all these different field names. So it does matter. There are dollars attached to those things.
So yeah, that's actually, I'm actually trying to open a company than doing that, right? That would be cool.
Exactly.
So in the timeliness perspective, it goes, in my opinion, both ways. It could be the time that it takes the data to pretty much get to your database, all the way from the ETL procedures, extraction, transformation, and loads of the data. That's important because that might define reality in your environment. I was in an environment that was taking minutes up to an hour to actually show that event happened on an environment. That's very interesting, because when you do some type of simulation, you might say, that didn't happen. I might not have detection or the data sources. No, it's just taking so much time to get to your stack, to your ELK stack or anything. And then at the end, of course, the data retention, because believe me, you might not find a pattern in 7 days, but if you extend it to a month, then you might have a better understanding of your environment. I've done hunts in 7 days. They are the worst, because unless you export the data out of every week and then kind of like put it together, it's really hard, because by the time you get to the next week and the third week, the data that you wanted to test later, then it's gone, and then you're testing new data and your whole pattern changes. It's really hard. So measure that every engagement. How much data do we have? And believe me, that drives also changes to your, to your resources that you have.
So there's lots of things you could measure. You could talk about like hunt metrics as part of your organization. We provide some examples right here of things that might be relevant. But we thought we would give you a couple of alternatives to this that might be a little bit more effective. And I think, next slide, Roberto.
Yep.
And I think that this is a graphic that we've shown before. This is how some folks attempt to represent coverage. And I mean, how do you derive any meaning from something like this?
Yeah, like I believe that, for example, I started doing something similar before as well, and this is what I like to keep doing research, because also improves the way how I try to look at things and I learn from other people, and I think that we all should be doing that. In this case, even though now we have a better understanding that a color now might be tied to percentages of how much data I have for that detection of that technique and things like that, you might have that understanding now after this talk, but still hard to visualize. You might have a legend with like 10 colors, and you will be going back to your legend and saying, wait, red meant this, purple meant, wait, green. No, green to me actually means something better than
green
purple.
with black text, yeah. Green with white text.
So to me, it's you have to start understanding that your visualizations, you gotta tell a story with your visualizations. And in this case, for example, I'm a fan of going now from the lightest color to the darkest color because it tells you something. This one tells me a lot of things, but I don't know what they are. This tells me at least that there is some type of progress might be happening, something that probably a weakness to something more like stronger and things like that. So it gives me something to think about, and then you apply, of course, now what they mean and things like that, but this should tell you something. Now, what I like about using a heat map also was that after talking about data against attack, if somebody now asks me, what is my detection for PowerShell? If I go to the data sources that I'm actually collecting to validate the detection of a technique that uses a variant that uses PowerShell, then to me it's easy to say, hey, all these techniques in here, depending on the variant that you're using, I have data sources that map to PowerShell, so my detection about PowerShell is across these 50 techniques or 100 techniques. Then saying PowerShell is just one square in the framework. So once again, the heat map to you at the beginning might not be as useful because you start identifying those things. You say, wait, but PowerShell is one, so I don't like the heat map anymore. I don't like the idea of having this whole thing. It depends how you use the heat map, and depends how you are approaching the detection of techniques. In this case, if I look at it from a data perspective, then to me it makes more sense. I can tell you what techniques require specific data sources that might map to something like PowerShell, for example. And then I would love to do also hunts depending on the data. I like to do that because it touches several techniques. It doesn't just touch one thing. So I think that keep that in mind when you start applying this type of scenarios.
What you're seeing here is Attack Navigator, another wonderful thing that MITRE has released to the community, and it's just the proportion of data sources covered versus those that exist as recommended data sources. So it's a simple ratio, easy to get this map.
And when you started doing these heat maps also, we recommend, I think you were saying that Endgame does that as well, which is like, starts dividing something like coverage from a data perspective, from an analytics perspective. You can start showing at least different scenarios and then have a better understanding of what you're trying to accomplish with each heat map. In this case, we have data sources. In the other case, we have analytics, which is something that Devon then will be talking about.
Yeah, so we're going to jump right into this. This is not going to be a big data science or machine learning talk, but those principles are definitely going to play a role here. If we can advance. Yep. And we're gonna go right past this slide. So we're gonna start with statistics. In our last talk, we showed this slide from Chris Garrett's. It is a great slide that illustrates kind of the trade-offs between threat hunting and traditional like alert-based products. And basically the difference is hunt products need to be resistant to things like false negatives and false positives, but you don't want that from a platform that's supposed to alert you. And where this usually comes into conflict is if you use a product that does both things, so a multi-purpose device. So what are we measuring now? Well, when alerts fire, when we run hunts, we collect metadata about true positives, which is just malicious things we correctly call bad, and false positive, which are benign things that we incorrectly call bad. And fortunately, statistics gives us a tool for this called precision, which is just a simple division. All the stuff you label in the denominator, the true positive count in the numerator, and this winds up giving you a confidence score, which is basically how much you tolerate false positives. And here's just an example, 100 events, 74 true positives, a 0.74 precision, so 74% tolerant of true and false positives. But that's not a good measurement of how well the analytic works. So for that, statistics gives us a different measurement called recall. And for this, we need false negatives. These are the things that are bad, but which we don't characterize as bad. These are the things we miss. So when leadership asks you, what have you missed? These are going to be the things that you want to count up. And again, you simply divide your true positives by all the stuff that is actually bad, whether you found it or not. And this example does give you that metadata. But you have to be wary of going too far one way or another. If you happen to have perfect recall, it basically means everything that you find basically is bad, but all the other stuff is bad too. You have so many false positives that it becomes a meaningless measurement. And with perfect recall, you wind up with a similar challenge. So going too far one way or another does not help you. You do have to find a middle ground. So there was a step I skipped, just for those folks who might be concerned. How do you determine false negatives in these contexts? And it's really the place where adversary simulation plays a role. Adversary simulation gives you counts of the techniques that you want to find. So whether you're using something like Red Team Automation, whether you're using Uber's Meta, MITRE's Caldera, any of the other frameworks that you can package, you can get those numbers. But that doesn't mean you can't use a Red Team or a third-party service provider, because they will give you reports. So harvest that data, count those numbers, and suddenly you have the ability to measure recall, which is a much more meaningful measurement of how good you are at detecting a thing. It also has a strong relationship between data quality, because if you don't have the sources of evidence, if you can't run analytics against them, if it's in a different time frame, suddenly this whole thing falls apart. All of your numbers go sideways on you.
And the reason why we're approaching it this way also is keeping it separate from the data quality measurements and things like that from a hunting perspective, is that there might be 110 or 5 variations of a technique. So you cannot just say, if I have 5 analytics, I'm great. You cannot measure it against something that might be like infinite or just unknown. It's something that you cannot see. So that's why we like to keep it separate and approach the security analytics development by applying the concept of a true positive or a false positive, false negatives, and things like that. And so that's actually...
And this works whether you're talking about rules, signatures, human processes, or threat hunting. Those are all detections, and they can all be measured in the same way, using adversary simulation as one input, again, noting that adversary simulation might be your red team or other human beings. And getting closer to precision, getting closer to recall also lets you figure out how good you are at assessing badness. And so data science gives us this thing called an F1 score. You can see the formula kind of up here, and using the examples from before, those analytics basically gave us an F1 score of 0.71. Now, this isn't an arithmetic average, it's a harmonic average, which makes it a little bit easier to express averages of rates, which is what we're talking about, rates of true, false positives, etc. And we can even map these to visualizations that help us understand what that looks like. So here's a notion of like what F1 scores look like in a table. This 0.71 basically means that we're finding about 60% of all the bad stuff, which is the true positives and the false negatives. We're just calculating that ratio. But if we advance, you'll see that we might have an organizational need for a different number. Slide ahead. So what if your organization says everything we do must be 80% successful? Well, we can just figure out our threshold is a 0.4 and work backwards. We can figure out how tolerant we are and then use available data and human processes to tweak these approaches, whether it's a threat hunt, an analytic, a signature, we control this. And this is a data science-based approach, not a machine learning-based approach. We do have to know what we miss in order to create these thresholds. However, from there you could go on and you could look at finding ideal thresholds, and this is a graph that basically shows what's called a receiver operator characteristic curve, or a ROC curve. This is a tool that a lot of data scientists use to express how tolerant they are of these thresholds. Basically, the area underneath is how well you're doing, and you can measure yourself against this, even plot out hypothetical curves to see if maybe those give you better true and false positive averages. And all of this can be done with common scripting and just a little bit of visibility into your data. So that's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot of stuff. Yeah. We could probably keep going with more aspects of this topic. I think measuring how well we are at finding evil is very important to the entire industry.
So something that I wanted to add in there, just a closing thought, is that if you thought that threat hunting was just going to a console and run a query and then hunt like that for a month, that's not what threat hunting would be. As you can tell, there is a lot of stuff that happens besides that. It's interesting when I talk to people that does data science. I'm like, where do you spend your time the most? I mean, I do a lot of this transformation and make sure everything is good, the quality of my data, and then when I apply my model, it might not be as at the same time that I spend doing the rest. I see that as a similar thing happening in here because we're trying to develop all these analytics, trying to do all this crazy stuff that is really cool, but threat hunting, in my opinion, should be also looked at as there are procedures, things that should happen before you do that and also after you do your hunting engagement that involve the whole process of threat hunting. And I think that that's what I want you to take away from this presentation is to understand what needs to happen when you want to do threat hunting, right? Go into the console, go crazy, do this analytics and stuff. It's beyond that. As you can tell, you got to focus a lot on what you have, what you need, how you can get better, how can you be efficient, how can you be organized, right? From an attack perspective, for example, MITRE ATT&CK framework, and then how you can start then measuring your analytics in a way that also would impact your organization.
So we have three last things. If we advance, we do want to thank. So we've got some links. We also have an appendix, so it's stuff that we didn't include in the talk, but we wanted you to have in the slides. But we also wanted to just thank some folks, basically everybody who contributed the Beyond Data Science blog, MITRE, of course, and all of the defenders who have given us feedback since B-Sides Charm.
Thank you. Thank you very much.